tool that I will use, and that is the hair marker right here. I love the hair marker, and I think that most people, once they buy one of these, will find that they can use it for about 900 different things in their studio and out. I've used it in the kitchen. It's a very, very helpful tool. I use it when I play with metal, I use it when I play with clay, I use it when I'm stitching, and it's pretty much the only thing I'll mark my quilt with. All it marks, however, is a crease. It shows up great on solid and slightly mottled fabrics, but a highly printed fabric doesn't show up great at all, but neither does any other marking tool. The nice thing is you don't have to worry about, will this mark come out, because it's just a crease. Will the mark come out? Yeah, eventually. Or if you stitch over it, or if you mist it with water and let it dry, it's gone. Okay? Is it going to come back? No, it was just a crease. I don't have to worry about whatever chemicals make up that marker. There are no chemicals in it. It's a piece of Teflon. Okay? So the hair marker is pretty much the only thing I'll use. But let's say I want to put one of those designs that are, I think, applique designs back there on the plain blocks in my quilt. All the plain blocks in my quilt, I want one of those designs on. Well, I can trace that design on a piece of Golden Threads quilting paper. And if I have 12 blocks, then I can cut 11 more pieces of that paper and pin it behind my trace design, put pins in each of the 4 corners, go to my sewing machine with no thread going through the needle, and stitch around that design. What it's going to do is perforate through all those layers. Then I just pull a layer off, pin it in place on the quilt, and follow the perforated design when I stitch. To remove the paper, and it's so easy, I've seen people fight taking that paper off because they didn't read the instructions. The instructions say pull opposite diagonal corners. When you do that, the paper just pops right off. If you do this, it gets all stuck. So it just pops up. It does get stuck a little bit in the seam line. You just rub that out with a dry toothbrush, not your husband's. They get mad and use theirs. He will never know. So that's an option if you really think you have to have the same exact design over and over again. Okay. All right. So that's marking tools, batting, and thread. So the next thing is talking about that most common question I hear all the time, which is, yeah, but how do I decide how I quilt this quilt? How do I quilt this quilt? Hey, Heather, how do I quilt this quilt? Oh, gosh. You look at the quilt and you ask yourself, is this quilt top enough? You look at, is it visually enough? When I look at it, am I stunned? When I look at it, do I go, oh, you're beautiful? If it's enough, the answer to the quilting question is very simply. Very simply. Not a whole lot of bells and whistles. Not a whole lot of flourishes. Not a whole lot of design. Just enough stitches to give it the life I want it to have. If I look at that quilt top and I go, it's just not as exciting as I hoped it would be. That's when, sorry about that, I forgot to turn off my phone. That's when you say, okay, well, where can I add a little bit more to punch it up? I've got these 4 corners here of background space that's kind of boring. Maybe that's a good place to put something. And then I say, well, what do I put? The answer to that is nothing that's going to compete with what's on the surface of the quilt already. Okay? Nothing that's going to compete with what's on the surface of the quilt already. So you want to enhance what's there and not overwhelm what's there. Now I always say, why did you go through the hassle of doing the piecing? The hassle, because some quilts are a hassle to piece. Of doing the piecing to stomp all over it with the quilt. Okay, we don't want to stomp all over it with the quilt. So we look at the quilt and we say, what can we do that will enhance this quilt? Now if I finish the quilt top and I look at the quilt top and go, oh my gosh, you're the most boring thing I ever pieced. That's when I probably have the opportunity to add decorative quilting, where I'm going to really pump up the volume with the quilting. Probably add some motifs that aren't present already. Really add something, because the piecing, the fabric choices, it wasn't enough to keep my visual interest for very long. Now if you really, 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 really just like to quilt, do a whole cloth quilt. That's a great time to show off your quilting. It means there's no piecing. It's just one piece of fabric and you just quilt all over it. Okay? Whole cloth quilts used to be made for weddings all the time. They quilt white on white. They were beautiful, beautiful. It was a way to show off your quilting ability with hand quilting, and now it's a way to show off your quilting ability with machine quilting. Okay? So the quilting should enhance the quilt and it should never overwhelm the piecing of the quilt. The two should support each other. All right? So you've probably seen quilts at shows where the machine quilting was beautiful, but you couldn't even tell the person what the design of the quilt was after you saw it. You might have saw it with your best friend and it won the machine quilting award, and then you leave and you go, remember that quilt that won the quilt? What was the piecing on it? You can't even remember because the quilting overwhelmed the piecing. You didn't even see the piecing anymore. The two should work hand in hand. Diane Godinsky again, fabulous machine quilter. She has this quilt on the front of her book. Her book is called Guide to Machine Quilting. It's solid fabrics made in very somber colors, and it's so heavily quilted, it's stunning. That quilt needed that quilting. She picked a big, simple Amish star that was massive for the center of the quilt, very simple piecing, very simple fabrics, so that it wasn't about the piecing, it was about the quilting. Okay, so they need to work in conjunction with each other. The quilting is secondary, however, to the design if the quilt has an actual design to it. All right? So I want to have you look at a few quilts here so that you can understand density and you can understand how the quilting affects the quilt. So the first thing are these two blocks, and I'll pass them around. You can start again?
It started.
Oh, it started?
Yep.
Okay, good. And you can pass them around. So this is the same block pieced in the same way, and the one in my right hand here has all over quilting on it. So the quilting has crossed over the piecing lines and has flattened everything down to one plane. Okay? Whereas this one, each section is quilted differently. The background is quilted heavily. The center of the star is quilted the heaviest so that it pushes it back the farthest. And the star tips are quilted the least so that they come forward the most. So here we have a lot of depth present, and here we have a very flat visual plane. Do you see the difference in those? The quilting affects the quilt. Now this quilt is quilted approximately every 1/4 inch all the way around. It would last through World War III. This quilt is quilted approximately every 1/4 of an inch here, and approximately every 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch here. And here, what we're going to measure is this portion here, which is about an inch, maybe an inch and a 1/4. What we don't want is quilting densities that are more different than an inch and a half. So if this was quilted every 1/4 of an inch, the farthest apart we would want our quilting would be 1 3/4 of an inch. More disparity than that, then we're going to end up with areas of our quilt that we can actually pick up the top layer or pick up the bottom layer, and that makes it very easy to get caught on things. So if you've ever ripped a quilt on your bed or on the headboard or footboard, because I ripped a quilt recently on the footboard of my bed, or not a quilt but a bedspread, because it just hooked on one of the screws down there. If the quilt were all moving as one, its chances of ripping would have been a lot less, but it was actually one of those duvet covers. So the duvet cover, of course, moved totally separately from the rest of it, and it just, big old ripping. Okay? So check these out.